President Donald Trump has upended the international trading system. He has undermined the alliance system, which was the which was a key element of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. big power status in the post-World War II world. We have a major war happening on the territory of Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Israeli genocide in Gaza. You have these major conflicts. And then you have sharpening economic and military competition, rivalry between the big powers, US and China, of course. To your mind, does all of this create a crisis for the global South, or is there an opportunity?
It's very easy to say all these terrible things are happening. It's just happenstance, it's just coincidence. Well, I would argue it is not. The crisis occurs precisely at the moment when the old is dying and the new is not yet born. And it's at that moment, he added, all sorts of monsters appear. Needless to say, the liberal international order, founder principles like multilateralism, free trade, commitment to international law, and so on and so forth, has totally disappeared, no longer exists.
The traditional argument that the West used to make, the US, the UK and others, was that democracies like India, Chile, Brazil, South Africa should limit their dealings with China, say, and expand their dealings with the West.
The whole notion that the West stands for the defense of universal human rights has been disproven by the war in Gaza. Why? They have, the United States and Germany, they have provided the weapons with which this genocidal war has taken place, killing 67,000 civilians, including 20,000 children. So all pretense that the West stands for the defense of universal human rights has shown to be an empty thing. The West stands for the defense of human rights when they are of Europeans and people that look like Europeans. Anybody else really doesn't matter, whether it's Yemen or Congo or Sudan.
Active non-alignment, to your mind, what is its importance? What does it represent? How does it differ from non-alignment that used to exist in the past? Hello and welcome to this special interview for The Wire. We're going to talk today about the non-aligned world, the non-aligned movement, the place of the global South in international politics, topics which are close to every Indian's heart, given the fact that India was one of the founding countries of the non-aligned movement. Joining me to discuss the place of non-alignment and the place of the global South in international affairs today is Ambassador Jorge Heine, former Chilean diplomat, former ambassador of Chile to India, to China and to South Africa, three key countries at this particular global juncture. In addition, he's been a minister in the Chilean government and above all, I would say, a scholar, an academic, author of more than a dozen books. The two that we are going to talk about today are the most recent books of his. One is called Active Non-Alignment, and the other, which was just published this year, The Non-Aligned World. Ambassador Heine, welcome to The Wire.
Thank you so much.
Let me start with a big picture question. The global situation is in a complete state of turmoil today. President Donald Trump has upended the international trading system. He has undermined the alliance system, which was the which was a key element of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. big power status in the post-World War II world. We have a major war happening on the territory of Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Israeli genocide in Gaza. You have these major conflicts. And then you have sharpening economic and military competition, rivalry between the big powers, US and China, of course. To your mind, does all of this create a crisis for the global South, or is there an opportunity for Chile, India, South Africa, Brazil, other countries of the global South to be more assertive, to try to shape this global order? How would you consider the role of the global south at this time?
Small question. Let me hark back a little bit. First of all, let me say, I think it is an opportunity. That's the first point. It's important to keep that in mind. But it's important to understand what lies at the root of this predicament in which the world finds itself. It's very easy to say all these terrible things are happening. It's just happenstance. It's just coincidence. Well, I would argue it is not. As Gramsci put it, the crisis occurs precisely at the moment when the old is dying and the new is not yet born. And at that moment, he added, all sorts of monsters appear, And that, it seems to me, is what we're going through. The old international system, in its most recent incarnation called the Unipolar moment, is fading away, and it is being replaced by something else. We are not quite sure what it's going to be, but it's certainly not what we had before. Needless to say, the liberal international order, founder principles like multilateralism, free trade, commitment to international law, and so on and so forth, has totally disappeared, no longer exists, given what we see in the United States right now and elsewhere. So the question then arises, to quote Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, what is to be done in these circumstances? And it seems to me that what we have today is this remarkable rise of the voice of the Global South. What we have seen in the course of the past 3 years, and it's not me who says it, Foreign Policy Magazine, a quintessential voice of the U.S. Eastern establishment, called 2023 the year of the Global South. Why is that? And the reason is, it seems to me, it's quite straightforward, and there are two factors here. One of them is an economic factor. A key element in what the World Bank is called the wealth shift from the North Atlantic, which commanded the political economy of the world for the past 2 centuries, to the Asia Pacific. There's this great statistic of the 10 cities in the world with the largest number of billionaires. 5 are in Asia, 3 in the United States, 1 in Europe, 1 in Russia. No prizes for which one is a city in India in that category. But the point I'm trying to make, that wealth is being created in the Asia Pacific, and that is the most dynamic and fastest growing region in the world. This means that what we used to call the third world, and we now call the Global South, is in a very different position from what it was in the 20th century. It is in a position of much more significant economic strength. A key change there is what I call the shift from the diplomatie de carrière de doléance of the third world, victimhood diplomacy, the new international economic order. You need, NAM told northern countries to transfer money and wealth to us to compensate for the exploitation of colonialism and imperialism. That didn't get anywhere, needless to say. Today, we have a very different picture, what has been called financial collective statecraft, embodied in entities like the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, whose first chairman was an Indian banker, the Latin American Development Bank. So it's a totally new environment. And so with this economic underpinning, if you will, you also have the political superstructure that goes with it. And over the past 2 years, we have had 3 developments that have given enormous impetus to the Global South. One of them was, we were talking about this earlier, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in which many countries across the South took a very different position from that of the West and of NATO. To the surprise of many, but that is a fact. Suddenly, non-alignment was fact with a vengeance. 2, BRICS expansion. In Johannesburg, my own stomping grounds, in 2023, at the summit held of the BRICS countries, BRICS expansion took place. The BRICS countries today are 10 countries. The latest member to join is Indonesia, fourth largest country in the world, largest Muslim majority country in the world. And that has become a very important preference point. Now, it's important to underscore that the BRICS is not a platform of the Global South.
I mean, you have two.
I would argue that Russia and China are not part of the Global South.
Right.
But the other members are. But my point is, the BRICS is a platform for the Global South because it has embraced, the cause of the Global South. And three, of course, Gaza, which, to my mind, has been such a significant turning point. I mean, the contrast in the Western attitude towards what has happened in Ukraine and what has happened in Gaza couldn't be greater. The whole notion that the West stands for the defense of universal human rights has been disproven by the war in Gaza. Why? Not only has the West not, stood up for the people that have been killed in Gaza, they have, the United States and Germany, they have provided the weapons with which this genocidal war has taken place, killing 67,000 civilians, including 20,000 children. So all pretense that the West stands for the defense of universal human rights is shown to be an empty thing. The West stands for the defense of human rights when they are of Europeans and people that look like Europeans. Anybody else really doesn't matter, whether it's Yemen or Congo or Sudan or Gaza. So that has struck people across in Latin America, the reaction on Gaza, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Chile, and so on. I mean, what is most extraordinary, Lula, very early on, President Lula of Brazil said, what is happening in Gaza is genocide. And he was called out. How can you say that? You cannot say that about what Israel is doing. Well, today it's become the common wisdom. But all these things, what I'm saying is that, South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice, alleging a violation of the Genocide Convention. Brazil, as chair of the United Nations Security Council, put forward resolutions for a ceasefire in Gaza on repeated occasions that were vetoed, but Brazil took the initiative. So what I say is that the Global South has raised its voice very significantly and has become very much a reference point for, countries around the world, and with an economic heft and a political clout that the third world did not have.
Jorge, is there a problem with the heterogeneity of the Global South? I mean, you have, as a term, this includes, countries obviously of a certain economic standing,
Sure.
But politically, there's a huge amount of variation. I mean, just compare Brazil and Argentina, for example, or I would say even India and South Africa. You couldn't have two very different positions on the war in Gaza than these two, supposed pillars of the Global South. So how do we deal with the fact that the Global South is not politically homogeneous and they have really quite different global outlooks?
So, well, I will say this. This is an argument I've been having now for the past 4 or 5 years. And in fact, serious scholars have written articles that saying that the Global South is, in fact, a term that shouldn't be used. And in fact, it should be retired because it is a dangerous term. Now, to say that the term is dangerous strikes me as, somewhat complex. In the social sciences, we shouldn't worry about the danger of terms. We should be worrying about the accuracy of terms. And yes, it is true. Obviously, the Global South is a very heterogeneous entity. And you have very rich countries, say Qatar, and you have very poor countries like, Central African Republic. And so people have made the argument, there is no such thing. It's just a bunch of countries. Well, I respectfully disagree. What these countries share, the vast majority of them, first of all, they share a past, colonial past. That's number one. Number two, and this is even more important, they share a sense that they have been excluded from the high table of politics, of international politics. I mean, the fact that the P5 of the UN Security Council has two Western European nations, the UK and France, but there is no country from Africa and there's no country from Latin America, tells you there's something deeply wrong in this kind of arrangement, you know. And what these countries feel in common is that they don't have a say in, you know, in the P5. They have very low voting shares in the World Bank and in the IMF. And by and large, they don't get much of a say in, you know, how to run the world. Now, what is most remarkable here is this. There was this notion that, you know, there were the serious countries in the world, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. These were the serious countries. They knew how to run the world, you know, as opposed to these parvenus that were just coming up. And, you know, you go through the literature in 2014, 2015, and, you know, the mainstream press and so on, you will find this argument that the BRICS countries are, you know, fine as far as they go. But the time had come for the so-called serious countries like the United States and the United Kingdom to take charge because they had the diplomatic experience, they knew how to do things. Then in 2016, two things happened. There was the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, which was one of the probably worst decisions any country has ever made. Why would you want to leave the biggest market in the world? Well, they did. And as a result, I spent the next 4 years dealing with the European Union and how to get out of the European Union. And two, the United States elected Donald Trump, which immediately left the Trans-Pacific Partnership, left the Paris Accords, left the World Health Organization in the middle of the worst pandemic in 100 years. Now, these are the so-called serious countries that know how to run the world. They couldn't run their own pandemic. They both had some of the worst results of any country in the world. And they are supposed to be the leaders that know how to run the world. So that whole myth about, you know, the so-called serious countries that know how to run the world has evaporated. And therefore, it seems to me, there is space for new countries like China, like India, like Brazil, like South Africa, like Mexico, to take a much more significant role.
Tell us a little bit about your advocacy. I mean, you use the term in your writings, active non-alignment. When you first used the term, again, there was a, shall we say, kind of blowback or a kind of a counterpunch saying this is an obsolete term. I remember when I was part of a group of authors who wrote a book called Nonalignment 2.0, yes. And we had similar response from scholars in America saying, "Oh, this is obsolete." Active non-alignment, to your mind, what is its importance? What does it represent? How does it differ from non-alignment that used to exist in the past?
Sure. So it's important here to be clear about how and why this term arose. So this term arose in the context of Latin America 2019-2020, when it was hit by a triple whammy: the pandemic, the ensuing recession, and the pressures by the Trump administration, first Trump administration, to cancel all sorts of projects because they were China-related. So, with my colleagues Carlos Fortil and Carlos Ominami, we decided that we needed some sort of fresh approach to deal with this very serious crisis in which Latin America found itself. And the term resonated. We published a book in Spanish, a little volume in Spanish on it, that came out just 3 months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as you quite rightly say, when we published the book, it was accused of being anachronistic. And then suddenly, in February of 2022, non-alignment was back with a vengeance, because many countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America did not stand with the West on the issue, particularly of sanctions on Russia and the US strategy of permanently weaken Russia so that it can never undertake such a thing again. Well, for much of the world, you may agree or disagree with Russia, But the notion that you should permanently weaken it is not something that people who believe in a multipolar world will necessarily endorse.
Just to clarify for our viewers, essentially the non-aligned bloc or the global south, most of them took a clear stand against the invasion and in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Of course.
But did not support the idea that
Western sanctions.
that this should be turned into a grand geopolitical confrontation between East and West, where countries like ours would have to choose. And I think that this is the and you held that up. You hold that up in your book and in your writings as an example of what non-alignment in the current era would involve.
Of course, suddenly there was this notion that the war in Ukraine is a unique war.
Right.
That never in the history of mankind has there been such a war, and therefore all 200 countries in the world must take a stand.
And agree to sanctions and everything.
That's right, and get Russia out of the SWIFT system. There was talk of getting Russia out of the internet
That's
system.
right.
You know,
.ru.
This is, this is. What about the war in Yemen? Who advocated for sanctions against the United States after the war in Iraq was totally unwarranted, undertaken under false pretext? And then, of course, you get the contrast with the attitude on the war in Gaza, in which this is seen as something, So the basic point is this, on active non-alignment. So we take a page from the non-alignment of the 50s and 60s, but adapted to the realities of the 21st century. Basically, what we are saying is countries should not side either with Washington or with Beijing in this great power competition. We should focus on our own interests and make our own choices. And the thing is this, what we have now is a competition which allows for countries to make a choice. This was not the case, and this is very important, this was not the case during the Cold War. Why? Because although Russia, then Soviet Union, was a significant military, ideological space and nuclear power, its economy was smaller than that of the United States. It was also a closed economy. So, there were no trade flows, financial flows, investment flows that could benefit.
So the Soviet Union provided political, military cover / assistance, ideological assistance, and was crucial in many, for Angola, for Cuba and so on, but lacked the economic heft to actually make it.
Today the situation is very different. Yeah. The Chinese economy in PPP terms is already larger than the US economy. Some people project that by 2030 it will be larger in market price terms. And it is more and more so, in many ways, a more open economy than the United States economy is. And there are many projects. The Belt and Road Initiative is one example of China building infrastructure across the Global South. So basically, governments in the Global South can now choose. They can say, I want to do this. The case of Peru is a very good example. Peru built the port of Chancay, which is the most advanced port on the western coast of South America, inaugurated last year by President Xi in November. With a Chinese company, COSCO, that built it, $1.3 billion investment, will go up to $3.6 billion. Now, this was a Peruvian private initiative. These Peruvian investors went to the United States and said, we want to build this port. Callao, the traditional Peruvian port, cannot handle our, cargo anymore. They were told, no, we're not interested. They went to Europe. Europe wasn't interested either. Well, China was interested. So who can criticize Peru
you
for
mentioned
doing this?
In Trump,
Yes.
The first administration, pressure on Chile and others.
Yes.
Can you give us an example of the kind of pressure that, that you faced?
Absolutely. So there was one particular project that when I was ambassador in Beijing, the Chilean government, in 2016, the Chilean government submitted a project to install a fiber optic internet submarine cable connecting Valparaiso and Shanghai. There is no internet cable that connects Asia with South America today. All the electronic communications have to go through North America, which means they are more expensive and they are slower. And so we submitted this project, signed an MOU, a pre-feasibility study was undertaken. There was a change of government in Chile, strong pressure from the Trump administration. Secretary of State Pompeo visited Chile for this purpose and read the riot act to the Chilean government. This project cannot go, and the project was cancelled. Similar things happened in in Panama, in Ecuador, elsewhere. So, these are major projects. We live in the digital age. Collectivity is, the rule of the game. And if we can do that, there's a problem.
The traditional argument that the West used to make, the US, the UK, and others, was that democracies like India, Chile, Brazil, South Africa should limit their dealings with China, say, and expand their dealings with the West because of so-called shared values, that China is dictatorial, China doesn't believe in democracy, the West does, the West believes in human rights. Clearly, that argument has worn very thin, if it ever applied, with Trump doing what he's doing within the US and globally. Is there a case to be made today as part of the project of active non-alignment, the assertion of the Global South, to pick up the banner of universal human values, values that the West has abandoned or that the West never fully embraced, and for the Global South to become champions of some of these values, press freedom, for example, labor rights? Is there a case to be made for the Global South actually saying, look, we are the ones who believe in the importance of values?
No, I think that's a great point. And I will say this. Active non-alignment as a sort of project, as a manifesto, is an ongoing project. It is a work in progress. We have now published 2 books. The most recent, The Non-Aligned World, striking out in the era of great power competition, published by Polity Press in England and in the United States. In that book, what we set forth is that active non-alignment is a non-ideological project, that it is not of the left or the right, that what it does is it provides a guide to action, a compass to navigate these troubled waters of international affairs that we're living in today. Now, again, it's an ongoing project, and it may well be that as we continue to develop it, we may, incorporate some of the things that you suggest. But at this phase in the conceptual development, it is a very down-to-earth, practical guide to action that purports to provide governments with the tools to make the very difficult choices they have to make. And let me give you a very concrete example. Sometimes people say, well, this may be useful for larger countries, the Brazils, the Indias, the South Africas of this world, but smaller countries really, can't use it. Well, that is not the case. The case of Ecuador is a perfect example. The president of Ecuador, a couple of years ago, he, in 2022, visited President Biden and said Ecuador needs a free trade agreement with the United States. It's President Guillermo Lasso, a conservative millionaire businessman from Guayaquil. And President Biden said the United States does not sign free trade agreements anymore, so forget it. So what did President Lasso do? He went to China and said, we need a free trade agreement. And the Chinese said, fine. And a free trade agreement was signed and negotiated and came into effect in May 24. His successor, President Daniel Noboa, also from a conservative family from Guayaquil. First visit he made after he was re-elected for a second term, to China. Now, why? Well, because China provides opportunities that the United States is not providing right now. So this is not a question of small or large. It's not a question of right or left. It is a question of how to handle a very difficult and complex situation. And what you do is you don't choose sides. When we refer to it as basically, playing the field, and that's what you do. And you hedge your bets. You don't have to say, I am totally opposed to President Trump, or I despise, the violations of human rights in Beijing. That is not the way you manage your country. We live in very uncertain and very difficult times. And you make the wrong decision, it may cost you very dearly. So you have to, be very careful in what you do.
India is one of the important countries of the Global South. I would say, having looked at the evolution of Indian foreign policy over the last two decades, that there was a time India took its eyes off the Global South and the non-aligned movement and was sort of pursuing other vectors, in particular its relationship with the US. And we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years a subtle pivot back towards the Global South, and this is more pronounced now that the US option has kind of dried up. We saw some examples during the pandemic of India, taking a lead in providing indigenously developed vaccines, COVID vaccines, to countries that were being denied vaccines.
In Latin America, that was very much the case.
Yeah, some countries, Latin America, Caribbean, the Chinese did the same thing.
Sure.
Other than that, I would say, if one takes a very cold, dispassionate analysis of India and the Global South, and the whole question of, India likes to think of itself as a leader of the Global South. I would say on certain key critical issues, the war in Gaza, for example, a country like South Africa has shown what leadership means by going to The Hague, filing its case. Is there more that India could do? Is there more that India needs to do if the Global South is to truly exercise the kind of influence on world affairs that it ought to?
Well, let me say this. I would make there's a certain competition, it is said, between China and India for the leadership of the Global South. I would argue, I was privileged to be both ambassador to India and to China, and China is a country I also have great respect for. But China, if we apply some rigor, is not really part of the Global South. China competes with the United States in this great power competition. So we should be clear about that. That's the first point. The second point, once we clear that, it seems to me that once we establish that, the country that has the obvious advantage for exercising leadership of the Global South is India, both because of its size, because of its location, because of its history, and so there are many reasons for it. But there are two things that I would emphasize here. One of them is, I used to have a colleague at Boston University, she's now at University of Toronto, Manjari Miller Chatterjee, wonderful scholar, and she writes
on India and China.
On India and China, that's right. And she has made the argument that India is a reluctant power, that Indian elites have basically decided, and for good reasons, that India's internal challenges are such that they will focus on that and not pay that much attention to foreign relations. The net result of that is that India has a foreign service with around 1,000 diplomats. Now, to give you an idea how small that is, Chile is a foreign service of around 500. Chile is a country of 19 million. The United States is a foreign service of 12,000. China is a foreign service of 10,000. Brazil of 1,400. So, if you want to really play that role, you need to, invest in it. You need a larger foreign service, and you need a much larger foreign presence. Again, another example. No Indian Prime Minister has visited Chile since Indira Gandhi did in 1968. Now, some people might say, who cares about Chile? Well, Xi Jinping has visited Chile 3 times in different capacities. So, the point I'm trying to make is that there's enormous room for India to play a much larger role in the world than it has until now. If you want to lead the Global South, it's not enough to simply interact with, India, in my view, has had this view, we interact with peers, with powers that are large powers, medium powers. We don't deal with smaller countries. That's beneath us. That's not the way forward. That's not what the Chinese do. The Chinese deal with everybody. which is what India should.
Yet one of the noticeable features of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister is the fact that he has travelled to many more countries than his predecessor. I mean, than his immediate predecessor. He's greater willingness to travel.
Well, but yeah, Prime Minister Manmohan traveled very little. You know, he had a coalition government, so it was very difficult for him to leave the country. Yeah. That is true. But still, I would argue that there is still much more room for interaction with African and with Latin American, with Asian countries. You know, smaller countries, medium-sized countries, not the Brazils and the South Africans of this world. And if you want to exercise leadership, you have to do that. You want to, you know, exchange views and well, engage with these countries. And you know, there's enormous goodwill for India, for its history, for its democratic institutions, for its spiritual leadership, its contribution. I mean, in my courses at Boston University, I would say that two of the you know, most significant ideas of the 20th century, you know, peaceful resistance and non-alignment, came out of India. You know, now that is intellectual and spiritual leadership of the highest caliber. And so, again, that gives it, you know, gives India enormous strength, enormous opportunity. You know, Martin Luther King did his doctorate in theology at Boston University. And when he visited India, he said, when I visit other countries around the world, I go there as a tourist. When I come to India, I come as a pilgrim. And he said that because, you know, peaceful resistance, Gandhi's thing, was what inspired him. You know, so that's there for the taking.
Right, and were India to actually draw on the wellsprings of its own global traditions and assert itself on the international platform, that would really make a big difference for the global South as a whole and for international affairs.
Absolutely, absolutely.
On that note, Ambassador Jorge Heine, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
That wraps up this discussion on the international situation and the role of the Global South. Thank you very much for watching. If you believe in the kind of journalism and wish to support the kind of journalism that The Wire does, do consider financially contributing. We are a non-profit platform that relies on our readers and viewers to survive. So go ahead, subscribe to our channel and consider becoming a member. Costs you just 89 rupees a month. Thank you very much.